In October of 2021, the Port of Seattle was dismantling its past. The target was Dry Dock Number 5, an aging leviathan of steel being carved up for scrap. The demolition crew was following 70-year-old blueprints when their plasma torch met an undocumented alteration. Where a standard maintenance hatch should have been, there was only a thick, crude bead of industrial weld sealing a ballast pontoon shut. Breaching protocol, the foreman used a hydraulic spreader. With a final groan of tortured metal, the plate gave way, revealing not an empty tank, but a sealed tomb. In the cavernous dark, huddled together, were the skeletal remains of a man and a woman. Beside them, a rusted toolbox and 4 words etched into the steel wall. "O-Ren knows we are in here." At that moment, the case of Stanley and Sal, a couple who had vanished without a trace into the Seattle fog 20 years earlier, was no longer cold. It was active. 20 years earlier. November 2001. A persistent, cold rain slicked the asphalt of the Port of Seattle, and a thick fog blurred the lights of the cranes into indistinct halos. It was a night like any other, governed by the predictable rhythm of tides and cargo manifests. Stanley, the dock foreman for Pier 17, was a man who thrived on that predictability. At 48, his life was a testament to meticulous routine and unwavering integrity, qualities that had earned him the respect of every longshoreman on the waterfront. That evening, however, his routine was disturbed. He'd stayed late, poring over shipping logs under the harsh fluorescent lights of his office. Colleagues would later recall him being uncharacteristically tense that week. His focus narrowed on a series of manifests from a company called Ishii Pacific Maritime. He made notes in the small leather-bound book he always carried, his pen scratching with quiet urgency. The numbers didn't add up, and for a man like Stanley, a discrepancy was not just an error, it was a violation. A few blocks away, the warm glow of Sal's cafe was a beacon against the gloom. At 45, Sal was the unofficial heart of the port community. Her establishment wasn't just a place for coffee, it was a sanctuary where workers shared stories, celebrated births, and mourned losses. She knew everyone by name, knew their orders by heart, and her laughter was as much a fixture of the waterfront as the cry of the gulls. The last known contact was a phone call, logged at 9:14 p.m. Stanley, frustrated, told Sal he'd forgotten his reading glasses and couldn't make out the fine print on a last-minute cargo transfer order. It was a simple, domestic request. A problem with a simple, domestic solution. An hour later, Sal tidied her counter, leaving a half-full pot of coffee on the warmer for the early morning shift. She locked the cash drawer, but, in a habit born of trust, left the front door unlocked. She grabbed Stanley's glasses from the counter where he'd left them that morning and stepped out into the misty night. Her car was seen on a grainy security camera turning toward the restricted dock area, its headlights cutting briefly through the dense fog. She was just a wife, bringing her husband his glasses so he could finish his work and come home. It was the last act of their normal life, the last time anyone saw them as people and not as a mystery. The next morning, Stanley's truck was in its usual spot, his uneaten lunch on the seat. In the cafe, the coffee had grown cold. By noon, the first worried phone calls began. They went unanswered. The port, shrouded in an impenetrable fog, had swallowed them whole. Detective Harry Callahan of the Seattle PD's Cold Case Homicide Unit stood on the deck of Dry Dock Number 5, the damp air thick with the smell of ozone from the plasma cutters and the ancient scent of salt water and decay. Below him, the breached pontoon was no longer a piece of scrap. It was a sarcophagus, and now it was his crime scene. For the next 48 hours, under the glare of portable floodlights, the sealed tank became the sole focus of a world-class forensics team. The space was a capsule of silence, untouched for 2 decades. Every surface was coated in a fine layer of rust and grime. Inside, the work was methodical and grim. The skeletons, identified by the medical examiner as one male and one female, were carefully documented in situ before being removed. They were found in a corner, positioned in a way that suggested not violence, but a final, desperate embrace. There were no obvious signs of trauma on the bones, no bullet holes, no blade marks. The cause of death appeared at first glance to be the environment itself. Suffocation, dehydration, a slow, terrifying end in absolute darkness. The objects left with them were catalogued with surgical precision. The flashlight was a heavy industrial model, its casing pitted with corrosion. The toolbox contained a wrench, a set of screwdrivers, and a single, miraculously preserved leather notebook. But the most immediate and electrifying piece of evidence was the inscription on the wall. Scratched deep into the steel with what looked like the tip of a screwdriver, the letters were jagged, carved with force and terror. "Oren knows we are in here." The name was not a clue, it was an accusation from the grave. Callahan's investigation began not with the bodies, but with the tomb itself. This led to the first critical questions. Question 1, the weld. Metallurgists confirmed it was a high amperage industrial weld, far too strong for a standard maintenance seal. Who had access to that kind of equipment on the docks, and the authority to use it on a restricted structure late on a foggy November night? The port's maintenance logs for that week, Callahan would soon discover, showed nothing. Question 2, the location. A ballast pontoon on a floating dry dock is not a convenient place to dispose of two bodies. It is a highly secure, specialized piece of marine hardware. Hiding someone here required intimate knowledge of the port's layout, security blind spots, and operational schedules. It required planning. It required access. This was not a random act of violence that needed a quick cover-up. Forensic analysis of the air inside the pontoon revealed it had been hermetically sealed. Analysis of the sediment on the floor showed no foreign contaminants, nothing to suggest a struggle had occurred inside. Stanley and Sal had walked into that pontoon. They had been sealed inside alive. The evidence pointed not to a spontaneous crime of passion, but to a meticulously planned operation. An execution engineered with the cold precision of a logistics problem being solved. The killer wasn't just a murderer, they were a project manager. And Harry Callahan now had their name. The only problem was, Oren Ishii was not some back-alley criminal. She was an untouchable titan of global commerce. To understand the triumph of the 2021 discovery, one must first understand the failure of the 2001 investigation. In the weeks following the disappearance, the Seattle Police Department mounted a significant search. Divers combed the frigid, murky waters of Elliott Bay around Stanley's Pier. Canine units worked the docks, but the scent trails vanished in the rain-soaked industrial maze. Detectives interviewed dozens of port workers, friends, and family. The picture that emerged was of a stable, content couple with no known enemies and no reason to flee. With no bodies and no signs of violence, the official investigation quickly stalled, branching into three equally unsatisfying theories. First, a voluntary disappearance. The couple had secretly liquidated assets and started a new life. But a thorough financial audit revealed nothing of the sort. Their bank accounts were untouched, their life savings intact. Second, a murder-suicide, a theory unsupported by any aspect of their lives or personalities. And third, the most probable and yet most frustrating conclusion, a tragic accident. They had fallen into the water, their bodies swept away by the powerful currents of Puget Sound. The name Oren Ishii did appear in the initial case file, but only briefly. She was the CEO of Ishii Pacific Maritime, a major port client, and Stanley's ultimate, if distant, supervisor. She was interviewed once. Flanked by a team of corporate lawyers, she presented an image of detached cooperation. She described Stanley as a reliable foreman. She offered company records, all of which were pristine. Her alibi for the night in question was a well-documented charity dinner. To the lead detectives of 2001, she was not a suspect. She was a powerful business leader inconvenienced by a minor internal matter. But behind the scenes, a different current was moving. Ishii Pacific was more than a client. It was an economic engine for the city. Unofficial calls were made. Port officials spoke to city leadership about the potential disruption a prolonged, high-profile investigation could cause. A narrative began to circulate through channels of influence. This was a personal tragedy, not a conspiracy. The police department, facing pressure to allocate resources to more solvable crimes, began to quietly shift its focus. The investigation into Stanley and Sal was never officially closed. It was simply starved of resources until it withered. This was not merely negligence. It was a form of systemic complicity, a quiet consensus among the powerful that the questions surrounding the disappearance were more dangerous than any potential answers. The silence that fell over the case was not passive. It was an active, strategic choice, built on a foundation of economic interest and willful ignorance. The port community was left with rumors, their fear and suspicion given no official outlet. Within 19 months, the case file was moved to the inactive records department. Stanley and Sal were reclassified from missing to presumed deceased. Their names became a local cautionary tale, a ghost story told by longshoremen on foggy nights. The wall of silence, built with corporate influence and civic indifference, had held. For 20 years, it had proven to be as impenetrable as welded steel. With the physical evidence secured, Detective Callahan's hunt moved from the tangible world of steel and bone to the ephemeral realm of memory and paper. The investigation bifurcated, sending one team into the city to track down the ghosts of the Port of Seattle, and another into the cavernous city archives to dissect the paper trail of 2001. Both endeavors were an exercise in patience, a search for a single coherent signal amidst 20 years of noise. The interviews began. Callahan spoke with retired longshoremen, men whose bodies now bore the physical cost of a lifetime of hard labor. Their memories of Stanley were clear and fond. Their memories of that specific November night were clouded by time and a palpable, lingering fear. One former crane operator, now in his late 70s, spoke in halting sentences, his eyes constantly drifting towards the window. He recalled seeing men in dark sedans near Pier 17 that week, men who didn't belong on the docks. They weren't cops, and they weren't feds, he whispered. They were corporate, the kind of quiet that's louder than shouting. Another witness, a woman who had been a waitress at Sal's cafe, wept as she recounted the confusion and dread of that morning. She remembered Sal being worried about Stanley, saying he was onto something big at work, something that was making him lose sleep. But when pressed for details, her memory dissolved into the general anxiety that had gripped the community. The name O-Ren Ishii was met with a uniform reaction, a tightening of the jaw, a quick shake of the head. It was a name that still held power, a door that no one wanted to open, even 2 decades later. Simultaneously, the archival team descended into a world of microfiche, dot matrix printouts, and brittle, yellowed paper. They meticulously reconstructed the 24 hours surrounding the disappearance. They cross-referenced security gate logs with employee time cards and shipping manifests with customs declarations. For weeks, the work yielded nothing but dead ends and mundane details of a port operating at full capacity. The official records were a fortress of normalcy, perfectly constructed and utterly impenetrable. The first crack appeared not in the port's records, but deep within the financial archives of a defunct subsidiary of Ishii Pacific Maritime, a shell corporation designed for logistical support. There, buried in a quarterly expense report, was an anomaly. A series of discretionary bonus payments authorized the day after Stanley and Sal vanished. The recipients were 3 members of a night shift welding crew and a security supervisor at the main gate. The amounts were significant, enough to be life-altering for blue-collar workers in 2001. The The security supervisor, they discovered, was transferred to a low-level post in Tacoma less than a month later. One of the welders quit his job and moved out of state. The other two remained, their employment records pristine until their eventual retirements. The pattern was clear. Key people in key positions on that specific night were either paid off, moved away, or silenced by loyalty. But it was a single small invoice, misfiled under acoustic remediation, that made the hair on Callahan's neck stand up. It was a purchase order for 5 industrial-grade acoustic dampening blankets, delivered to an Ishii Pacific warehouse a week before the disappearance. There were no construction projects or noise complaints on record for that area of the port. There was only one reason a corporation would need to secretly muffle the sound of heavy industrial work in the dead of night. They were hiding something not from sight, but from sound. Just as the investigation seemed to be zeroing in on Oren Ishii, a new lead emerged, arriving not from an archive or a witness, but from the digital ether. An anonymous email sent from a heavily encrypted server landed in the police department's cold case tip line. The message was concise and chilling. It claimed that in 2001, Stanley was not a victim of corporate malfeasance, but a casualty of his own radicalism. The tipster alleged that Stanley, a vocal opponent of port automation, had secretly been meeting with a militant anti-globalization group that was planning a major act of sabotage at the port of Seattle. The theory was compelling because it was anchored in a verifiable truth. Stanley had indeed filed formal grievances against Ishii Pacific's aggressive automation proposals, arguing they would destroy the livelihoods of his fellow workers. To a team of detectives 20 years removed from the events, this kernel of fact made the anonymous claim credible enough to pursue. Callahan, a man who trusted evidence over instinct, diverted significant resources to chase this new shadow. The focus shifted from Oren Ishii, the corporate predator, to Stanley, the potential extremist. For weeks, the investigation went down this rabbit hole. Detectives tracked down the aging leaders of defunct activist groups, men and women now living quiet lives in the suburbs. They pored over records of protests and direct action campaigns from the turn of the century. They found Stanley's name on a mailing list for an anti-corporate newsletter. An old activist vaguely recalled a quiet, intense man from the docks asking questions at a public meeting. For a moment, the theory felt solid. It painted a grim but plausible picture. Stanley, a man of principle, had become entangled with dangerous elements. In this version of events, the meeting on the docks was a clandestine rendezvous gone wrong. Perhaps a bomb had gone off prematurely, or a violent internal dispute had erupted. Sal, arriving at the worst possible moment, was simply caught in the tragic fallout. The theory was clean, it explained the secrecy, and it provided a motive that had nothing to do with a powerful billionaire. The investigation was on the verge of recontextualizing the entire crime. But a theory, no matter how convincing, is only as strong as the facts that support it. And this one was about to collapse under the weight of an irrefutable contradiction. While Callahan's team chased ghosts in Oregon, the forensics lab finally broke through the water damage and faded ink of Stanley's leather notebook. The recovered text contained no mention of sabotage, no contacts for radical groups, no plans for destruction. Instead, it contained page after page of meticulous professional observations, container numbers, seal discrepancies, and manifest weights that did not match their official logs. It was the work of a diligent auditor, not an anarchist. The final, hastily scrawled entry was the killing blow to the false trail. Sal is here. Oren's man saw us. We have to hide. Stanley wasn't meeting with allies. He was running from an enemy. The false trail had cost them weeks, but it had also inadvertently strengthened their focus. With Stanley's notebook now yielding its secrets, the investigation was re-energized with a singular, unshakable purpose. The pages were a map, and Detective Callahan's team began to follow it, not into the past of activist circles, but into the labyrinthine world of global logistics. The container numbers Stanley had so carefully recorded were the key. For days, investigators cross-referenced these 20-year-old identifiers with archived bills of lading and international customs databases, a painstaking process of digital archaeology. Most of the numbers corresponded to legitimate shipments that had reached their destinations without incident. But then, they found it. Container number IPMU 482219. According to the Port of Seattle's records, it was loaded on the night of the disappearance, its manifest listing its contents as industrial drill parts bound for a mining company in Spain. But international records told a different story. The container had been flagged for a random inspection by Italian customs officials in the port of Genoa 6 weeks later. When they broke the seal, they did not find drill parts. They found a priceless 16th century samurai armor set, a national treasure reported stolen from a private museum in Kyoto. The discovery was an intellectual detonation. Suddenly, every scattered piece of the puzzle slammed into place. The motive was no longer a mystery. Stanley hadn't stumbled upon a simple payroll discrepancy or a union-busting scheme. He had uncovered a sophisticated, high-stakes smuggling operation for priceless stolen antiquities, run under the corporate banner of Ishii Pacific Maritime. O-Ren wasn't just a ruthless CEO. She was the architect of a criminal enterprise that used her legitimate business as a shield. Stanley, the meticulous foreman, was the one unforeseen variable who threatened to bring the entire empire crashing down. The Genoa Customs report provided the final link needed to find the human accomplice. The loading crew supervisor for that container on that specific night was one of the men who had received a 5-figure discretionary bonus the next day. The man who had quit his job and vanished. It took Callahan's team 72 hours to find him, a retired welder living a quiet life of paranoid isolation in a small town in rural Oregon. Callahan found him in a cluttered workshop, a man haunted by the last 20 years. At first, he denied everything. But as Callahan laid out the evidence, the bonus payment, the transfer records, the notebook, the old man's facade crumbled. His confession came out in a torrent of guilt and fear. He described a menacing man named Silas, O-Ren's head of security, pulling him aside that night. He was handed a thick envelope of cash and told there was an urgent containment breach on pontoon 4 of dry dock number 5. He was ordered to weld the main access hatch shut, no questions asked. He said he thought it was a drill, a strange one, but he was too terrified of Silas to refuse. He admitted he heard a faint banging from inside as he laid the final bead of weld. Silas told him it was just the structure settling. He was warned that if he ever spoke of that night to anyone, his family would pay the price. He had kept his secret for 2 decades, not out of loyalty, but out of pure, abject terror. Based on the recovered notebook, the welder's confession, and the forensic evidence, we can now reconstruct the final, terrifying hours of Stanley and Sal. The timeline is no longer a mystery. It is a transcript of a meticulously engineered crime. It began shortly after Sal arrived at the docks with Stanley's glasses. Stanley was not in his office. Guided by a hunch, she found him near dry dock number 5, his small notebook open in his hands, watching from the shadows as a non-standard cargo container, IPMU 482219, was being loaded under the personal supervision of a man who did not belong on a loading crew. That man was Silas, O-Ren Ishii's head of security. At that moment, Stanley was no longer an internal problem to be managed. He was an active threat, and Sal, by her simple act of love and concern, had just become a witness. Silas saw them. There was no shout, no overt threat. He and 2 other men simply moved to block the pier's only exits, their movements calm and deliberate. Their presence was a silent, physical statement. There was no escape. Stanley, a man who knew every inch of the port, made a split-second decision. He grabbed Sal's hand and led her towards the dark, looming structure of the dry dock, a place he knew would be deserted. He saw an open access hatch on one of the ballast pontoons, a temporary refuge. a place to hide until Silas and his men moved on. It was a fatal miscalculation. Inside the pontoon, the air immediately grew stale and heavy with the smell of old steel. They listened, hearts pounding, for the sound of retreating footsteps. Instead, they heard the heavy clang of the steel hatch being slammed shut, plunging them into absolute, disorienting blackness. A moment of confusion turned to panic. Stanley fumbled for his industrial flashlight, its powerful beam cutting through the dark, illuminating only the cold, unyielding walls and their own terrified faces reflected in the condensation. Then came a new sound from outside, a low, aggressive hum, followed by the hiss of superheated gas. A brilliant, impossibly bright line of light began to trace the edges of the hatch. Stanley knew that sound intimately. It was the sound of a plasma torch not cutting, but welding. It was the sound of a box being sealed. In that moment of horrifying clarity, they understood. This was not a temporary confinement. This was a disposal. This was their grave being finished while they were still inside it. As the hum of the torch continued its methodical circuit, Stanley took a screwdriver from the toolbox he always carried. In the flickering beam of the flashlight, he pressed the tip against the steel wall. With all the strength despair could give him, he carved his final entry into the only logbook he had left. It was not a plea for help. It was a final testament meant for a future he would never see. O-Ren knows we are in here. When the torch finally went silent, it was replaced by the sound of footsteps walking away on the deck above. Then there was only the crushing silence of the sealed pontoon and the sound of their own breathing. The oxygen in their small steel world had just become a finite resource. Their time was now measured not in hours, but in breaths. The arrest of O-Ren Ishii was not a quiet affair conducted in the pre-dawn hours. It took place under the crystal chandeliers of a Manhattan ballroom during a charity gala where she was being honored for her philanthropic work. The image of the elderly, impeccably dressed billionaire being led away in handcuffs by plainclothes detectives was a spectacle of profound cognitive dissonance. The media storm was immediate and seismic, a clash between the public image of a revered corporate stateswoman and the chilling accusation of a 2-decade-old double murder. The trial was a masterclass in prosecutorial precision. The state built its case not on speculation, but on the cold, hard evidence that had been sealed in the pontoon for 20 years. The centerpiece was Stanley's notebook, its final damning entry displayed on massive screens for the jury to see. This was followed by the testimony of the retired welder, a broken man who recounted the events of that night with a voice still trembling with the memory of his fear. He was the human cost of O-Ren's secret, his life derailed by a single act of coerced complicity. Throughout the proceedings, O-Ren Ishii, now in her late 70s, observed everything with an unnerving, icy placidity. She was a silent, inscrutable defendant, her expression betraying no emotion as the story of Stanley and Sal's final moments was laid bare. Her defense team argued that Silas, her head of security, was a rogue actor who had overstepped his authority. But the prosecution successfully tied the bonus payments and the cover-up directly to O-Ren's executive authorization. Her enforcer, Silas, would never face a human court. Military records showed he had been killed in a private security conflict in Iraq a decade earlier, an anonymous end for a man who specialized in making others disappear. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. The verdict was read in a courtroom thick with anticipation. Guilty on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory, life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Port of Seattle, the news was a delayed exorcism. Old longshoremen who had known Stanley and Sal gathered at local bars, not in celebration, but in a shared, somber acknowledgement of a truth they had always suspected. The legal system had finally provided an answer. A name had been put to the crime, and a consequence had been delivered. But for the community that still remembered the warmth of Sal's cafe and the quiet integrity of its foreman, it was a hollow victory. Justice, served 20 years too late, is a different kind of justice. It closes a file, but it cannot mend the tear in the fabric of a community's life. Today, if you go to the port of Seattle and look for the mooring where dry dock number 5 once rusted, you will find nothing. The space it occupied has been reclaimed by the water. The dock itself was completely dismantled, its steel recycled, its dark history rendered down into anonymous raw material. New container cranes, sleek and efficient, now work the adjacent piers, their movements governed by the very automation Stanley once questioned. The physical landscape of the crime has been deliberately and thoroughly erased. The empire O-Ren Ishii built has suffered a similar fate. Ishii Pacific Maritime was broken apart by regulators and lawsuits, its name now a case study in corporate hubris. O-Ren herself is no longer a philanthropist or a titan of industry. She is federal inmate 77491, living out her final years in a maximum security penitentiary. The priceless antiquities she smuggled were recovered from private collections around the world and returned to their countries of origin. Her legacy, once written in stock prices and headlines, has been rewritten as a cautionary tale. Stanley and Sal were finally laid to rest in a small cemetery overlooking Puget Sound, their names engraved on a simple stone. The cafe is long gone, replaced by a chain coffee shop, but the story of the couple who vanished into the fog has changed. It is no longer a mystery whispered by old-timers, but a solved case, a testament to a quiet integrity that proved more durable than a corporate dynasty. They are remembered not for how they disappeared, but for the truth they uncovered. Of all the components of this long and complex investigation, only 2 physical artifacts remain. Stanley's small, leather-bound notebook, its pages now stabilized by archivists, and the section of the pontoon wall, a heavy rectangle of scarred steel cut from the wreckage before it was scrapped. It is kept in a climate-controlled evidence locker in the Seattle Police Archives, a permanent exhibit in a museum no one is allowed to see. The noise of commerce has returned to the port, louder and more relentless than ever. But beneath the hum of machinery and the call of the gulls, the silence is different now. It is no longer the silence of conspiracy or fear. It is the silence of a settled account. The 4 words Stanley carved in the dark outlasted the woman who put him there. They are a permanent record, proving that truth, no matter how deep you weld it into the darkness, will eventually find its own way to the light.